Hey guys, this is Standing for Truth and Raw Matt, and we are going to debunk Bill Nye the Science guy. As you're going to see here, Bill Nye makes a lot of claims. This is going to be a lengthy video, but it's going to take a lot of detailed and at times technical information to debunk everything he is saying. Bill Nye, you're going to see, talks about how evolution is a fact. But at the end of the day, a theory needs actual evidence for support. The evidence against evolution is overwhelming. Just to go over a few that I can guarantee Bill Nye will not be able to address is the fact that the very best claimed evidence for evolutionism has been destroyed. For example, they'll tell us that humans and chimpanzees are so identical genetically that their genetic identity is 98 or even 99% similar, but this is based on preferential and selective treatment of data. The actual identity is around 88% similar. And just to put that into perspective, that's 400 million DNA differences that exist between the two species. Humans are fundamentally different from all other forms of life when we actually consider genomics and functionality. The fact is, we see that genetic change is actually down and not up. We are therefore devolving due to mutation accumulation. Bill Nye will not be able to address the fact that the human mutation rate is alarmingly high. It's approximately 100 new mutations per person per generation. I debated Dr. Stefan Frello on this, and he had absolutely no argument. His only arguments were misunderstandings of the model of genetic entropy, because genetic entropy, genetic degeneration, is a fact. That means evolutionists such as Bill Nye, they commit the extrapolation fallacy. They'll look at change today and take that back long ago and far away and conclude that banana plants, whales, pine trees, and dogs are related through common ancestry. As you will see Bill Nye admit in a clip right here that bananas and humans are related. And he asks Ken Ham, what's the evidence to the contrary? Now, as we can see, Bill Nye has no evidence that banana plants and humans are related, because as I was saying earlier, the mutations, deleterious mutations are catastrophic. They lead to disease, they destroy, they corrupt. And these mutations, they're not a creative force. They degrade, they destroy, and they're entering the human population at a rate much faster than natural selection could possibly select away such mutations. Natural selection acts upon the phenotype and not the genotype. Natural selection will amplify the best beneficial mutations and get rid of the worst detrimental mutations, but natural selection can't see most mutations, and that's why they build up these low impact, near neutral mutations. They have such trivial effects on fitness that natural selection can do nothing about them. And the extremely high human mutation rate, it really is a profound problem. And the fact that these harmful mutations are only going to have a tiny effect on fitness, as I've said, that means most harmful mutations are essentially invisible to the natural selection process. And that means human genomes, and apparently all genomes, must be accumulating harmful mutations continuously, such that genomes must eventually rust out like rust on a car. It's continuous and it's destructive. Artificial mechanisms such as synergistic epistasis, mutation count mechanism, the rescue devices that have been employed by population geneticists, they've been falsified. At the end of the day, all evidence, the best evidence evolutionism and Bill Nye here would have to offer, has been destroyed. They'll say that human chromosome number 2 arose from a fusion of two ape-like chromosomes. But the fact is, the purported fusion site is actually a functional DNA element in a human gene. A lot of their so-called best evidence that Bill Nye would look to and can't refute the argument against is based on junk DNA, and the junk DNA era has been completely overturned and is no longer a valid form of evidence for evolutionists. For example, they'll say that humans and chimpanzees share genetic mistakes, aka pseudogenes. But pseudogenes we now know are functional DNA elements and not mistakes. Many of their most praised examples of pseudogenes or genetic markers have been overturned. The ENCODE project has revealed that over 80% of our genome is actively transcribed into RNA. They'll say the gene order along chromosomes has no function. They'll look to this to demonstrate common ancestry, but once again, the gene order along chromosome does indeed play important functional roles. And these nested hierarchies we see, the relative hierarchies across life, are characteristics of design. Everything we see points to a biblical base model and refutes a model of universal common ancestry. He says bananas and humans are related, but
from your perspective, all life is related?
Certainly.
So we're related to a banana?
Yes.
Okay.
We can actually look at Lenski's experiment. And this experiment is extremely significant, but what's funny is it's for opposite reasons. The bacteria, the E. coli bacteria in this experiment, they have not experienced forward evolution. Thousands and thousands and thousands, over 60,000 generations of bacteria. And we have learned that bacteria produce bacteria, and yet Bill Nye here wants to say that bacteria, banana plants, and humans are related through common ancestry. It's not even a good theory. It's not even a good hypothesis. There's no evidence. And in this experiment, the net effect has been reductive evolution. It's evolution going backwards. Yes, there's been some adaptation in this artificial environment, but it's been mainly due to loss of function mutations. And this type of adaptive fine-tuning, at best, can be called microevolution. And the fact that it's being accomplished through a net loss of information, for example, broken genes, deletions, broken functional systems, losing genes short-term, long-term degeneration, disrupted gene regulation. This is evolution going the wrong way. In all 12 experimental populations in this experiment, the functional bacterial genome has shrunk. It contains less total information. I'd love to see Bill Nye address this. This bacteria will quickly go extinct in any natural environment. If Bill Nye wants to use any type of experiment to say that humans came from something that was non-human, dogs came from something that was non-dog, dogs, humans, whales, and banana plants are related through common ancestry, this would be the experiment. And yet, at the end of the day, this experiment, which should have validated large macroevolution, has demonstrated very powerfully that the mutation and selection process has extremely serious limitations. They are not creative mechanisms. Mutations destroy. And so even given huge, massive populations and vast numbers of generations, this experiment, all that was accomplished was a very small, a trivial amount of adaptive microevolution, and we don't disagree with adaptation. We look to adaptation, we predict adaptation. The evolutionists will say, well, there's a trade-off. And although there has been some superficial fine-tuning happening in a handful of genomic sites, no one disagrees with this. Significant genetic damage has been accumulating throughout the rest of the genome, and many due to slightly harmful deleterious mutations that natural selection cannot act upon. They cannot be selected away. This means in the long run, the net effect will be degeneration, just like we see in the universe. Everything is winding down. Time is their god. With enough time, anything can be related to anything, but given a model population such as these bacteria, that would be optimal for validating evolution, proves that populations do not evolve, they actually devolve. Sorry, Bill Nye.
Bill Nye the Science Guy.
This was a conscious decision. I'm going to influence kids. I'm going to influence young people. Look at this sheet I produced for everybody who came to work on the show. This is in 1992. It says, the objective, change the world. That's the objective. That was the goal of the show. If you have this idea that the Earth is only 6,000 years old, you are denying, if you will, everything that you can touch and see.
There are many lines of evidence that we could use along this way of thinking. The recession of the moon, for example, I brought this up previously with a debate with you, Ross. I thought he's had a few years to think about it. He might have an answer to it now. The moon is moving away from the Earth due to tidal forces. And we know that tidal forces go as 1 over r to the 6th power, which means as the moon moves further away, it slows down, which means if you run the movie backwards, it gets faster and faster and faster. And the uniformitarian assumption would be it's always been 1 over r to the 6th, right? And so if you run that movie backwards, you'd find that in 1.4 billion years they collide. And again, that's an upper limit because they can't be closer than 0. Okay, so it's not a problem for a few thousand years where the moon would have just been a few hundred feet closer to the Earth, but it is a problem if you believe the Earth and moon are 4.5 billion years old. Spiral galaxy wrapping. You know, spiral galaxies, they actually wind themselves up with time. The inner portions rotate faster than the outer portions. We can measure that. We can measure the Doppler shifts of those stars. So for example, you have in the Whirlpool galaxy here. That's the linear velocity. When you convert it to angular, the inner portions rotate a lot quicker than the outer portions. And in fact, I've actually been able to simulate this. Let's see if it's going to play. It's not going to play, is it? Oh well. It wraps itself up ridiculously fast. I'll show you an image of the final result here in just a minute. My secular colleagues say, well, density waves come and form new spiral arms, but they believe the material is very tightly wrapped, in which case the magnetic field should be very tightly wrapped because magnetic fields travel with material. They don't travel with density waves. And so we'd expect the magnetic fields would be very tightly wrapped if this galaxy is billions of years old, but in fact the magnetic fields line right up with the spiral arms, what you'd expect if it's thousands of years old. So basically, if galaxies are 6,000 years old, they ought to look something like that because they haven't had a lot of time to wrap themselves up. I believe God created them spirals and they've wrapped just a little bit. This is the result of the simulation. That's for a 1 billion year old galaxy. That's what it would look like based on the measured rates of rotations of the star, revolutions of the stars. And galaxies are supposed to be 10 billion years old in the secular view. Okay? What do we find? Well, we observe that galaxies look like they're thousands of years old. It's interesting to me because you'll hear people say, well, why does the universe look so old? I'm thinking, what universe are you looking at? Not the real one. The internal heat of the Jovian planets, Jupiter, Saturn, and Neptune, give off more energy than they receive from the sun by a factor of about 2, something like that. And they can't do that forever because they're losing energy, right? They're expending fuel. You can't keep giving away more than you take in unless you're the federal government. But anyway, they can't do that forever. They're going to run out of heat, you see. And so, like take a potato out of the microwave. It's nice and warm. It's radiating that heat to space. Now Jupiter's a bigger potato. It can do that for a lot longer, but it can't do it for billions of years. And that is an issue in the secular view. Magnetic fields actually decay with time. We've actually been able to measure the Earth's magnetic field dropping over, we've been able to measure it for almost 2 centuries. It's an exponential decay from those measurements, and that's what we'd expect on the basis of just basic physics. We'd expect that it would decay exponentially. There's a sinusoidal perturbation on top of that. Now we think during the global flood, the tectonic motions would have affected that magnetic field, disrupted the currents, and you'd cause rapid reversals and things like that. But putting that aside and just assuming uniformitarianism, for the sake of argument, the magnetic field would just have been stronger in the past. It has we can measure the exponential decay. We know it has a half-life of 1,400 years. That means every 1,400 years it drops by a factor of 2. You run it back 6,000 years, it had been 20 times stronger at creation. That'd be kind of nice because that gives us increased protection from cosmic rays and things of that nature. If you run it back even 50,000 years, the magnetic field would have been 56 billion times stronger than it is today, enough to rip the iron right out of your blood. In fact, if you go back to 60,000 years, the Earth's magnetic field would have been as strong as a neutron star, which is the most powerful magnetic fields we know in the universe. It would rip your atoms apart. So it just can't be that old. Again, assuming uniformitarianism. It can't be that old. My secular colleagues are aware of this. And by the way, it's not just the Earth. The other planets of the solar system, a lot of them have strong magnetic fields. And my secular colleagues said, well, there must be some kind of recharging mechanism, you see. But they have to violate their own uniformitarian assumptions to get that because the decay appears to be exponential as far as we can tell. And also their recharging mechanism, which they call a magnetic dynamo, predicted that the magnetic fields would be well aligned with the rotation axis of these worlds. And it's not for many of the planets like Uranus and Neptune. It's not even close. In fact, my secular colleagues were expecting that the planet Uranus should have basically no magnetic field at all because it has no internal heat. And you need internal heat to drive that dynamo to recharge the magnetic field, allegedly. On the other hand, my colleague, Dr. Russ Humphreys, he's got a model for how God may have started the magnetic fields is really clever. And this is one of the few estimates that is giving us a true age estimate rather than just an upper limit. Based on Humphrey's model, the magnetic field of the planet Uranus should be within that little blue strip that you see there at the top. It should be somewhere between those two values. My secular colleagues believed that the magnetic field should be basically non-existent for the planet Uranus. And when Voyager 2 went past the planet and measured the magnetic field, the measured magnetic field is that. It's consistent with 6,000 years of decay. Isn't that interesting? It's nowhere close to what you'd expect for billions of years. Comets are another example. Comets are balls of ice and dirt, and they orbit the sun on elliptical paths, coming close to the sun and then swinging back out far away. And they lose material when they come close to the sun. And that's what forms a comet's tail. It's material being blasted away. We know the rate at which the material is leaving. We know the size of the comet. You can estimate a typical comet could last no more than about 100,000 years maximum before it totally runs out of material. And yet we still got comets. So if the solar system's billions of years old, why do we still have comets? My secular colleagues said, well, there's an Oort cloud that makes new ones. Basically a comet generator that we can't detect, but it makes new ones every now and then. And they're welcome to speculate on that, but I call that a rescuing device because, you see, I don't think there's any evidence for an Oort cloud. The bottom line is comets are an indication of the youth of the universe, or at least of our solar system, and there's evidence that other solar systems have comets too. So if the solar system is 6,000 years old, that's what we should see. If it's billions of years old, that's what we should see, which is to say we shouldn't see any comets, and in fact we do see comets. Blue stars are another example of the youth of the universe. We find blue stars ubiquitous in spiral galaxies, especially in the spiral arms. And they're beautiful, and they cannot last even tens of millions of years. And my secular colleagues will acknowledge that, because blue stars, even though they have a lot of fuel, they expend it very quickly, kind of like an SUV. They got a big tank, but they don't get very good gas mileage. So they can't last billions of years, and yet we find them everywhere in the universe. Everywhere in the universe. And my secular colleagues won't even argue the age. They know that blue stars can't last long. And so they'll say new ones must be constantly forming. But you know, we've never seen a star form anywhere in the universe, which is interesting. In fact, to get gas to condense and fall into itself and form a star is really problematic. Gas wants to expand. I think you know that. You didn't hold your breath when you came into the room in case all the air should go to that corner. You expected the air to expand and fill the room, and that's what it naturally does. Now, once God makes a star, its own gravity will hold it together. But in space, the force of gravity is tiny compared to the force of gas pressure in a typical situation. So in a 6,000-year-old universe, you'd expect to find lots of varieties of stars. Red stars can last long periods of time. It doesn't mean they're old, it just means they can last that long. Blue stars can't. You'd expect to find both. If the universe were billions of years old, you'd expect only the red ones would be left. Or you'd at least see stars in the process of forming, and what we do see is consistent with thousands of years. Really compelling. Of course, there's a lot of other lines of evidence I could mention that are indicative of youth, and I don't offer these as proof because, as I mentioned earlier, you can't prove scientifically the age of something. I'm just showing you that there's an inconsistency in the secular way of thinking in terms of uniformitarianism and naturalism. In many instances, it leads to results that are inconsistent with its own assumptions.
Somebody from public broadcasting called the office and said, "No, be sure to say it's only a theory, evolution." I said, "No, I'm not going to say it's only a theory." You'll hear a lot about the Grand Canyon, I imagine, also, which is a remarkable place, and it has fossils. And the fossils in the Grand Canyon are found in layers. There is not a single place in the Grand Canyon where the fossils of one type of animal cross over into the fossils of another.
Bill Nye here looks to the fossil record, to the geologic column. But what the fossil record actually supports, contrary to what Bill Nye would want all the kids to believe, is death and burial on a global scale. And guess what? This is exactly what the Bible describes in Genesis with the global flood of Noah. The existence of a fossil in general is absolute proof that it happened quickly. For example, environmental factors would prevent that organism from forming. But if it's covered, and any geologist can tell you this, if it's covered by sediment and protected, the fossilization process can start. And the fossil record in geology, itself prove biblical creation in the Genesis flood. We see rapid or no erosion between sediment layers. We see flat, featureless boundaries. We find whole rock layer sequences deposited rapidly in quick succession. Now, Bill Nye here, he'll say you've got this type of fossil in this layer, and you can see this in this clip in his debate with Ken Ham, and he'll say you got these types of fossils in these layers, and they think that it goes from marine fossils to land fossils in the order of pond scum to people evolution. But Bill Nye's lying. He's incorrect, because we've got marine fossils all the way through. Even with dinosaur fossils, what do we have? We've got marine fossils buried with them. This means, and it is a fact, especially because we read about this global flood in the Bible, it's a historical account. The order of the fossils is the burial order of the flood. And so if the flood began in the ocean, ripping up all those marine creatures and burying them onto the continents, they would be the first creatures to be buried. And as the floodwaters rose higher and higher, you get the burial of the land animals. And this is all exactly what we find. This means that everywhere we look, there's an abundance of evidence from geology that the flood really did occur. Nothing in the fossils, as Bill Nye here looks to, supports evolution. Bill Nye, he says that certain fossils should not be found with other fossils. And this is proof of evolutionary descent with modification. It's one of his biggest arguments. But the thing is, and the fact is, we do, and what the evolutionist does is change their stories and create rescue device after rescue device after rescue device. Evolutionary theory in and of itself is so absolutely rubbery, they can move it around and accommodate almost anything, and this isn't science. For example, dinosaurs and man did not live in the same habitat. Just like today, different creatures and different animals live in different habitats. In the pre-flood world, we see certain fossils that are usually buried together. And dinosaur fossils are usually buried with, say, gymnosperms, whereas mammal fossils are usually buried with things such as flowering plants. What does this indicate? It indicates two different ecosystems. Bill Nye doesn't understand or even want to look into the model of flood geology. Dinosaurs, for example, although they lived at the same time of man, did not necessarily live in the same areas or habitats. They were overcome by the flood at different times during the advancing of the waters, which explains why we don't find them buried together. Burial by ecosystems and habitats is just one of the many reasons and explanations for the flood layers and the fossils within the flood layers. We can even read in Genesis that the land of Eden, we are told, a river flows out of Eden. And we know rivers flow downhill. And so Eden was obviously at a higher elevation. We know certain animals, such as certain dinosaurs, lived in swampy lowland areas, and so various animals of various ecosystems and habitats were separated from man and other forms of life. And we can look to other explanations such as body density, intelligence, mobility, and of course habitats and ecosystems. At the end of the day, there is evidence that the earth was once underwater. We see marine fossils on mountains, in areas, landlocked areas that are actually far from the sea. Sedimentary rock layers extend over entire continents or even farther. That means the deposition of those layers had to have been catastrophic, or as I said earlier, there would not have been much fossilization. So how is Bill Nye going to explain the fact that we see fossils of animals giving birth, fish being eaten? All this suggests sudden and rapid burial. So all these observations they're in accord with the flood of Noah, covering the entire earth just a few thousand years ago. And at the end of the day, Bill Nye talks about how creationists don't make predictions. Well, when we look at the continents today, what are they doing? They're moving only very little. But when we look to Noah's flood, the flood is described in Genesis, we aren't looking at continental drift anymore, obviously. We are looking at continental sprint. The Bible tells us that the fountains of the great deep is broken open. The earth is fractured like an eggshell. Continents are moving vertically, horizontally. And this model of catastrophic plate tectonics, continental sprint, predicts that the pre-flood ocean crust would be dragged down into the mantle. This is a process that we call subduction. Bill Nye will know of this. Now, because that happened recently, of course, according to our model, say only a few thousand years ago, the cold ocean crust should still be cold. even though I think anybody can see that it has descended into the deep hot mantle. Now, modern seismologists have discovered that there are indeed huge cold slabs of rock down near the core itself, in areas that should have warmed up, if millions of years, of course, worth of time. They look to time. Deep time is their god. And they would say that this is what would have brought those slabs down instead of Noah's flood. But the fact that we have cold slabs of rock is absolute confirmation of flood geology and not old age geology. This is a confirmed prediction. Bill Nye clearly hasn't looked into creationist predictions. Future predictions, confirmed predictions, creationists are making them. Another amazing prediction, one of many, that has been confirmed in CPT is rapid magnetic reversals. The Earth's magnetic field draws our compass needle towards the north, but sometimes in Earth's history it draws it towards the south. Now, old age geologists believe that this has been happening for hundreds of millions of years and would have taken thousands of years to occur. It was old Earth geologists, as a matter of fact, that found confirming evidence of rapid magnetic reversals. And guess what? These are required for Noah's flood. They were taking a look at lava flows that would only take a couple of weeks in order to form. They took measurements of the skin of the lava to see the magnetic orientation. They were expecting to see almost no change as they went deeper into the hot lava, where the interior shift only slightly. Instead, what they found was the outside skin pointed north and the inside pointed south. So once again, we have confirming evidence from lava flows that the switch of magnetic field has to happen rapidly, which is exactly what flood geologists expected.
What do the rock layers show? Well, they show that the ocean waters flooded over the continents. How do I know that? Because there are marine fossils in rock layers covering the continents. That's right, marine fossils. Wouldn't you expect if they were marine that creatures lived in the ocean, they'd buried in the ocean? Well, why are they buried up on the continents? They had to get transported, lifted up by the floodwaters and dumped up on the continents. And wouldn't you and I expect to find widespread, rapidly deposited rock layers because the flood was a global and it went all around the Earth? Yes. We find rock layers that can be traced all the way across continents and even between continents. Let me give you examples. The Tepic sandstone at the bottom of the Grand Canyon. It's the first layer of the flood. It sits on that erosion surface that marks the beginning of the flood. There we can see it. That's the view from the south rim of the Grand Canyon. That little cliff at the bottom there sitting on top of an erosion surface. Let's look at it a little bit more closely. We can study its characteristics. You know what? We can trace that sandstone in outcrop and in drill holes all the way across North America, across to Greenland. You can go to Chippewa Falls in Wisconsin and you can see exactly the same sandstone with exactly the same features sitting on exactly the same erosion surface, sitting on the same crystalline basement. You can see it on a road cut in Missouri as well, in between. The same sandstone can be traced right across North Africa, right over to southern Israel, at Timnah. You've got the same sandstone with the same fossils, the same features, with the same erosion surface sitting on the same crystalline basement. Only a global flood would do that. The Red Wall limestone in Grand Canyon. Well, by the way, geologists are pretty smart. Why do you think they call it the Red Wall limestone? Because it's a limestone that forms a red wall. And it has unique features. You know, I was in Ireland nearly 3 years ago, and Killarney Castle is built on this rock here, and my eyes boggled. It's exactly the same limestone as in the Grand Canyon. The same features, the same fossils, exactly the same level. You can trace it across to England in the Yorkshire Dales, and you can, by the way, it's the same limestone in the Appalachians as well, so you got it in between, and you find the same limestone in the Himalayas. That's right, there's marine fossils near the top of Mount Everest. It's made out of flood-deposited fossil rocks. By the way, this is my last example, the chalk cliffs of England. Remember we looked under the microscope, this type of limestone is made up of trillions of microscopic shellfish? What I didn't tell you last time is that you can trace that limestone across the Northern Ireland, but you can also trace it across Europe to Germany, the Netherlands, Germany, Poland, all the way down to Israel, Egypt, Turkey, Kazakhstan. By the way, at the bottom of that cliff, a shepherd boy picked up 5 smooth stones to slay a giant. There's the same chalk beds as on the English Channel coast. And we've got the same chalk in the Midwest of the United States, from Alabama across to Colorado, from Nebraska to Texas. The same chalk beds. By the way, the same chalk beds are found in southern Western Australia. That's a global scale fossil graveyard made of all these trillions of microscopic shellfish. Well, what do the scientists say about the formation of this limestone called chalk? They say the chalk beds formed over millions of years as lime grain by lime grain and tiny shell by tiny shell fell to the ocean floor. They say a fraction of an inch every 1,000 years. Oh, but that's on the ocean floor. Where do we find the chalk? Up on the continent. And what other fossils are buried in the chalk beds? Well, if we go to the Niobrara chalk in Kansas, we find it's full of crinoids, perfectly formed crinoids that had to be catastrophically buried. Or this fish didn't get time to digest its food. You see the size of that fish? It's 12 foot long. Would you bury that a fraction of an inch every 1,000 years? The fish would have digested itself and swam away, wouldn't it? Or in the same chalk bed, you've got pliosaur fossils and turtle fossils 10 and 12 feet long across. You've got dinosaur fossils and bird fossils in the same chalk beds. How would you gradual, grain by grain, a fraction of an inch every 1,000 years on the ocean floor over millions of years, bury together such large sea, land and air-dwelling creatures on the continents, not on the ocean floor? See my point? Only if the ocean waters rose and swept across the continents, catastrophically burying these land and sea and air-dwelling creatures all together in this global scale fossil graveyard that's the chalk beds. Only the flood makes sense of that kind of evidence.
When there was a big flood on the earth, you would expect drowning animals to swim up to a higher level. Not any one of them did.
Thousands of dinosaur trackways up and down this peninsula, plus similar temporarily exposed low areas on other continents, suggest that dying dinosaurs and other hardy track makers floated, waded, and walked on freshly deposited mud, trying to find safe ground. The fact that over a dozen states in the US are filled with dinosaur fossils buried under heaps of mud also attests to the flood. In fact, geologists have found a temporarily exposed dinosaur peninsula where the dinosaurs made their last stand, now buried there along with lake and sea life transported by the massive waves. Now buried across it are pre-flood wetland plants and animals, including dinosaurs, turtles, frogs, fish, and many birds. Next, the massive Zuni megasequence hits. The Absaroka and Zuni megasequences are the most severe because the continental plates began to move more quickly from the original Pangea-like supercontinent configuration to where they are today. With oceanic rifting and plate subduction increasing dramatically and the continents traveling apart quickly, the tsunami-like waves began washing across western North America while virtually no sedimentation is occurring in the east. When coming up over the Dinosaur Peninsula, the Zuni catastrophically buries dinosaurs in the Morrison Formation, a 13-state area encompassing over 700,000 square miles. This Jurassic unit includes at least 141 massive dinosaur boneyards where dinosaurs like Camarasaurus, Diplodocus, Apatosaurus, Stegosaurus, and Allosaurus are found. The Cretaceous layers, like the Hill Creek Formation, are found on top of the Jurassic and hold hundreds of mass boneyards containing several different types of dinosaurs, such as T-Rex, Triceratops, Centrosaurus, and Edmontosaurus that had been living in a different ecosystem, also buried by the Zuni. The Zuni was so massive and fast that it engulfed entire regions with mudflow, burying giant creatures like this T-Rex under 50 feet of muddy sediment, entombed so quickly that preserved blood cells, blood vessels, and bone cells were found just recently. How much water does it take to pile 50 feet of mud on top of a dinosaur? The Dinosaur National Monument in Utah contains thousands of visible bones from 11 kinds of dinosaurs that were buried in a jumbled mass in the Morrison Formation, together with crocodiles, turtles, lizards, frogs, and clams. What type of event would it take to bury all these different land animals with millions of clams? When the Dinosaur Peninsula floods over completely, large herds of dinosaurs are entombed in massive fossil graveyards in the Upper Cretaceous system found in northern Wyoming, Montana, and Alberta, Canada. The dinosaurs had tried to escape by fleeing northward up the peninsula as waters advanced from the south. This explains this massive graveyard in northern Montana that's over 1.2 miles long and contains 30 million fossil fragments, representing over 10,000 adult Maiasaura that were simultaneously buried. In this entire collection of bones, not a single baby was found. Every one of these 10,000 Maiasaura was between 9 and 23 feet long. Does this seem like the adult dinosaurs were stampeding away from the raging floodwaters, with 100% of their young falling behind? Just 170 miles northeast of this location is one of the largest dinosaur graveyards in the world, one that even secular scientists admit was caused by a watery catastrophe. Here, thousands of centrosaurs are buried in 14 mega bone beds over an entire square mile, which is nearly 500 football fields. Looks like a massive herd of these creatures, thousands of them, were simultaneously buried in mud by Noah's flood. Just 45 miles west from this location is yet another massive flood deposit, and this one even has 49 different species of dinosaurs, buried along with turtles, crocodiles, fish, flying reptiles, birds, and small mammals. What type of disaster could bury nearly 50 species of dinosaurs and many other types of animals, including marine life, together in mass graves? These mass burial sites are common in the US as well. For example, look at this dinosaur dig site in Wyoming, where a 1-meter thick layer of mudstone stretches for 80 acres, with over 1 million bones buried in a graded, sorted bed, where big bones are found at the bottom and little bones on top. The only way to develop a graded bed like this is by a catastrophic process that transports these bones and deposits them during a single event. Large flying creatures like pterosaurs were able to fly to escape the rising floodwaters, delaying their demise until the later stages of the flood. The fossil record shows they are buried in many different layers all over the world.
Looking at the fossil record, we can see that ocean life dies in the ocean and land life dies on land. That's how it works. So we would expect to see aquatic life in deep sea layers because they were dying there far before the flood occurred. And until the flood came, which wreaked havoc on life existing at that time, causing dinosaur graveyards and things like that. Remember, when things die on land, they get eaten or degrade rather fast. The odds of life dying to make the quantity of oil that we find on Earth today is best explained by the flood. It's also safe to say that the fossil record is not valid when we find evidence of discrepancies in the record. And guess what? We do. The upside-down geologic column in Pakistan is one such place. At the foot of the Karakoram Mountains in the Salt Range Formation, scientists have discovered fossilized plants and insects. From the evolutionary perspective, these remains belong to the upper part of the geological column. However, this formation lies beneath the Cambrian rock, which is dated back to over 400 million years. Discoveries such as these support the biblical version of the Earth's history, whereby the geological column is primarily a consequence of the global flood and its aftermath. It is no surprise that there is some order to the fossil record, such as sea creatures buried beneath land creatures, and mobile creatures such as birds near the top. But, since as the Salt Range Formation testifies, the ordered charts that adorn textbooks aren't always what they find in the field. Many results today have kicked evolution hard in the dirt. They have found complete stasis in the entire Pliocene era. We also know that the Ashley phosphate beds in North Carolina have found human bones and artifacts with dinosaurs together. Also remember that they also found modern-day birds dating back in the Cambrian rock layers which supposedly evolved from dinosaurs. It's a total mess. Also consider that many of the biggest dinosaurs, such as the long-necked sauropods like the Brachiosaurus, Titanosaurus, and Apatosaurus, would have eaten colossal amounts of vegetation. So why do we not find such abundance of these plants in the rocks containing these dinosaur fossils? Take for example the Morrison Formation in Montana. Even though this formation had yielded many dinosaur fossils, they're very scarce in vegetation. This phenomenon of missing vegetation doesn't just apply to dinosaurs or their rock layers. The Coconino Sandstone in the Grand Canyon has many animal trackways, but it's almost devoid of plants. These rocks tell us something profound about Earth's history. They suggest that these deposits laid down are not ecosystems buried over eons of time. Otherwise, we'd find more evidence as plants that the animals ate. Instead, the evidence fits nicely with the biblical model of early Earth's history, whereas these animals were transported and buried catastrophically during Noah's flood. Geologists have assumed and say that calm weather conditions are required for these settling processes to occur to form mudstone. Therefore, whenever they encounter mud deposits, they interpret them as forming in tranquil water environments. However, recent research published in the prestigious Journal of Science has turned this argument on its head. The researchers showed that mud deposits form from rapidly flowing water. Yet again, evolutionary theory fails when put to the test, and we have more evidence for a global flood.
You find layer upon layer of ancient rocks. And if there was this enormous flood, wouldn't there have been churning and bubbling and roiling? How would these things have settled out?
Noah's flood lines up with brand new scientific research. Over 1,800 oil well boreholes from 4 continents have all been compiled and mapped. The newly emerging map tracks the thickness and extent of each rock type as they were laid down by the flood. This research reveals the same 6 megasequences of sedimentary rock deposits across multiple continents. Each megasequence contains a huge stack of rock, often with coarse-grained sandstone on the bottom, then finer-grained deposits like shale, then topped by limestones. Each megasequence is bounded above and below by flat, eroded surfaces called unconformities. A few places on Earth have layers that represent all 6 megasequences. How did they get there? What do they say about Noah's flood? Catastrophically water-deposited sedimentary layers top most of the world's continents. Would Noah's flood bring lots of water and lots of mud? Geologists agree on the 6 megasequences, but they differ on the timescale in which they happened. If they took millions of years, then they have little to do with the flood. But if they were all deposited rapidly and recently, then the flood should come to mind. Many also question when a larger landmass, such as a Pangea-like supercontinent, broke into continents that moved to their current configuration. For the first time ever, new megasequence maps allow us to see how the flood shaped our entire planet, just like the Bible said, including reconfiguring the continents. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, the 17th day of the month, the same day were all the fountains of the great deep broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. These 2 events, the fountains of the great deep breaking up and the windows of heaven opening, began the first day of a 371-day-long calamity that resurfaced the earth and killed everything that moved on land. Hot magma mixed with steam pierced the earth's crust. Giant rifts or tears ran thousands of miles across the planet. Scalding hot magma vaporized massive amounts of water that jetted into the atmosphere. The water fell back to earth as intense global rain, along with torrential rain from heaven for 40 days. Worldwide catastrophic rifting caused massive mud-filled tsunamis to speed across deep ocean floors, then onto shallow ocean floors, killing everything in their path. The first megasequence wipes out mostly shallow marine habitats. The bursting fountains of the great deep spew out megatons of magma and carbon dioxide. Sure enough, the first megasequence rocks show a spike in volcanic activity and massive amounts of carbon dioxide. During these first 40 days, intense water currents overtopped most of the flooded continents. Water-laden sediment travels at highway speeds. Thick sediment blankets start covering low regions of the continent. Fossils show that the first 3 megasequences buried the shallow seas that were filled with marine life, as these deposits have almost no trees or land animals. All 3 megasequences covered similar environments across North and South America and Africa, the 3 continents mapped so far. One global cause, Noah's flood, best explains this one worldwide effect. Then by the 40th day of the flood, the Absorica megasequence began hitting. The maps show that this is when things got much worse. Something shoves the water over the tops of even the high lands from that ancient world. The newly forming ocean floor offshore is so hot that it starts very thick, pushing up the ocean waters from beneath. Sea level rises dramatically. Molten magma rises and fills the widening gaps, pushing the mid-ocean ridges wider. The hot ocean floor shoves against the continents, then slides beneath them like giant conveyor belts, deep beneath the Earth in some places. Rather than the conventional model that has the seafloors spreading slowly, this runaway subduction actually happened quickly, moving at about 5 miles per hour, due to the heat caused by the friction and pressure of the rapidly subducting plates. As the diving ocean plates subduct under the land, they push down the continental edges and then release them, creating tsunami cycles that blanket the continents, just how tsunamis happen today, only more intense and frequent. For example, the most powerful earthquake ever recorded in Japan, and the 4th largest in history, was a magnitude 9.1 earthquake that occurred in 2011. This earthquake was caused by an undersea megathrust about 45 miles east of the Japanese coast. At the center, there was a 160-foot slip between the overriding plate that was part of Japan and the underlying Pacific plate. The sea bottom rose about 23 feet when the fault unlocked, and the resulting earthquake triggered a devastating tsunami that was 133 feet above sea level and traveled inland for 6 miles. The tsunamis occurring during the flood, however, were different, much different. With the ocean ridge bursting open rapidly and pushing the ocean floor under land continents on a worldwide scale, tsunamis were happening in cycles, several every hour, and with long stretches of subduction zones active at the same time. The incoming phase of a tsunami has a much higher speed and is highly turbulent, which keeps the sediment in suspension, but it leaves behind layers of sediment as it slows down in the retreating phase. This cycle repeats several times every hour during the 150-day inundation stage of the flood, first entombing the shallow marine life, followed by land creatures in different habitats and elevations, leaving behind what we see today in the fossil record. These types of tsunamis have even occurred in recent history, such as the tsunami caused by slipping ocean plates that hit the coast of Washington in 1700 and left behind multiple layers representing each wave of the tsunami. Recent seismic technology actually allows us to investigate whether this type of rapid subduction occurred. Sure enough, these scans reveal a ring of unexpectedly cold rock at the bottom of the mantle, beneath the subduction zones that surround the Pacific Ocean. The severity and elevation of this stage of the flood is why the first land creatures and plants start showing up in the fossil record laid down by the Absaroka megasequence. Entire ecosystems are buried in enormous deposits that later turn into coal, such as the extensive Appalachian coal beds. In fact, the U.S. has over 7 trillion tons of coal reserves. Where did it all come from? While we know that coal is formed by dead plant material being sandwiched between sediment layers, we only have enough vegetation on the Earth's surface today to produce just a fraction of the existing coal reserves. This shows that the pre-flood world was mostly covered by lush vegetation. The rising floodwaters and tsunamis that were necessary to sweep over the land and bury vast amounts of vegetation that turned into coal are best explained by a catastrophe of worldwide proportions. There's no doubt that widespread volcanism was also involved in finishing off the dinosaurs, as many of these mass graves are literally packed with volcanic ash, ash that in many cases was mixed with water when it emplaced the dinosaurs in their tombs. One section of the Morrison Formation, called the Brushy Basin Member, spreads across 5 states and includes over 4,000 cubic miles of volcanic materials. Without a single volcano in the Morrison Formation, geologists believe this material had to be carried all the way from volcanoes on the west coast, volcanoes created by the magma rising from the subducting ocean crusts plunging under the land. Today, these subduction zones form the Ring of Fire, responsible for over 90% of our earthquakes. The Bible records that on the 150th day of the flood, God made a wind to pass over the earth. The waters started to recede. The fountains of the deep and the windows of heaven were stopped, and the rain from heaven was restrained. Now enters the final mega-sequence, the Tejas. Here, after the water peaked over the top of the highest remnant of the pre-flood world, it began to rush off the continents, eroding and reworking some of the deposits laid down in the previous mega-sequences, especially carving away at the Zuni deposits. This final sequence appears to have been different than the others because there was a reversal in flow direction as the waters began to sheet off the continents. This flow reversal transported much of the fossils deposited earlier off the highest uplands, spreading them towards the edges of the continent. The evidence points to the Tejas draining the floodwaters southward off of the U.S. towards the Gulf of Mexico with a sheet wash pattern all at once. This is why we find massive sand deposits in the deep water of the Gulf of Mexico. Billions of barrels of oil have been discovered there, with much of it found within a massive 1,100-foot thick bed of pure sand in over 7,000 feet of water, over 200 miles offshore. In addition, plants swept off the pre-flood lands formed massive coal beds, such as in the Powder River Basin of Wyoming and Montana. These Tejas layers contain the largest coal deposits in North America that currently supplies over 40% of the coal in the U.S. Some of these stacked coal beds are up to 200 feet thick and cover areas that are 60 miles long by 60 miles wide. The sheer volume of plant material required to form such a massive layer of coal testifies to catastrophic circumstances. The massive runoff that began with the Tejas may also explain the lack of human fossils in the rock record. Any residual human remains left buried in earlier deposits were totally destroyed by the erosive, retreating floodwaters. In line with God's promise to wipe them from the face of the earth, any residual remains were ground up and likely spread in all directions over great distances by the Tejas, lessening the likelihood of finding any human fossil remains. Because humans were impacted earlier by the flood's violence, they were destroyed and thus not buried whole deep in the sediments, leaving no fossil traces. Erosion in the Tejas sequence would have affected the strata beneath, wiping away even traces of human remains buried in earlier layers. When God stopped the fountains of the Great Deep on day 150, the new ocean surface began cooling and sinking, allowing the floodwaters to lower as they sheeted off the continents into the new ocean basins. Psalm 104 describes the mountains being raised at the end of the flood, and the waters draining down valleys and off the emerging new land surfaces. The seafloor rifting process and the resulting mountain forming process explains why sea creatures are found on mountaintops all over the world, high above current sea levels. For the remaining 220 days of the flood, the water recedes from the earth and it dries out, allowing time for Earth to be replenished with vegetation for the animals to eat when they eventually come off the ark. This year-long catastrophe left behind a vast number of proofs that, quite frankly, make its occurrence obvious. First, we have the staggering volume of fossil-bearing sedimentary rocks around the world. Over 1 mile thick on average, billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down by water all over the earth. And the sediment they're found in lies above sea level. What sort of water process could emplace so much sediment above sea level on top of the land surface? Another clue is the vast horizontal extent of individual sediment layers with little to no erosional channeling between successive layers. What sort of transport and depositional process could conceivably generate such uniform layers over such vast horizontal distances? Many of these layered beds are separated by bedding planes on the scale of inches to feet, a feature so common that few stop to think about how it happened. It's as if the sediment is being deposited in pulses in a repeating manner, with each pulse producing a thin layer commonly found around the world. The flood tsunamis provide a perfect explanation, and it happened so quickly that there was no time between deposition of the layers for surviving critters to burrow into the layers and churn them over. What has been discovered, both from a creationist as well as from a secular understanding, is that much of the continental fossil record was already in place before any of the present-day ocean crust had come into existence at a rift zone. For example, all of the trilobite fossils had been deposited, plus all of the older coal deposits had already been formed before any of the present-day ocean crust had formed. Since in creationist understanding, the presence of fossils is a completely trustworthy indicator of the action of the flood, this means that much of the flood cataclysm had already unfolded and had generated fossil-bearing sediments on the continental surface before any of the present-day ocean floor had appeared. It further implies that all of today's ocean floor formed since the onset of the flood, during roughly the latter half of the cataclysm. It also means that all of the pre-flood ocean floor, plus the ocean floor formed during the earlier portion of the flood, must have been recycled into the Earth's interior during the cataclysm. These considerations indicate in a compelling way that rapid plate tectonics must have been a major aspect of the year-long flood catastrophe. This 6-megasequence worldwide flooding process perfectly set the stage for the subsequent ice age. The oceans had been tremendously heated by the rifting that had taken place across the 45,000-mile ridge system, and the creation of a completely new seafloor of hot lava as a consequence. This caused an abnormal amount of evaporation, and thus continuous rain that was likely worldwide. The volcanic activity created by the subduction zones that created the ring of fire would have spewed volumes of ash and aerosols high into the atmosphere, resulting in cooling, especially in the higher latitudes. These factors combined to produce an ice age that lasted a few hundred years, but ended as the conditions that caused it waned.
You never, ever find a higher animal mixed in with a lower one.
In South Carolina, one of the greatest dinosaur graveyards was ever found. It is an 18-inch thick layer, where they have found the fossils of whales, fish, shark, toads, crocodiles, alligators, turtles, monkeys, horses, camels, elephants, mammoth, mastodon, sloth, deer, pig, sheep, hadrosaurus, and humans, including artifacts. All of these are within the same layer. This was found and cataloged in 1881. So we can continue to listen to Bill here, or an actual scientist in the field.
Living fossils is just one of 4 simultaneous experiments that I carried out to test evolution. It was based on a simple prediction that if evolution was not true, and if animals did not change over time, I should be able to find modern appearing plants and modern appearing animals in the dinosaur rock layers. And this is in fact what I found. First, I found a fossil shrimp in a dinosaur rock layer that looked very similar to a modern appearing Gulf shrimp. Then I found a crayfish in a dinosaur layer that looked like a modern crayfish. Then a crab, then a prawn, then a lobster. Soon I realized I had found all of the major crustacean groups in the dinosaur rock layers. Then I turned my attention to the insects. First, I found a modern appearing dragonfly that was found in a dinosaur rock layer. Then a katydid, then a cockroach, then a cricket. And soon I had representatives of all of the major insect groups living today from the dinosaur rock layers, and they looked the same. Then I had representatives of all the shellfish groups, the echinoderm groups, etc. And soon I realized that I had representatives of all of the major invertebrate phyla living today. I'd found these in the dinosaur rock layers, and they looked the same. Next, I turned my attention to the vertebrates, and here I ran into problems. Museums were, for the most part, not displaying the most important vertebrate fossils. They were kept out of the view of the public. So I turned to the literature and began interviewing scientists, asking if they had seen any modern appearing vertebrates with the dinosaurs. And lo and behold, they had. Dr. Clemens reported finding a modern appearing parrot in a dinosaur rock layer. Others reported finding ducks, loons, flamingos with dinosaurs. This was utterly amazing. And others reported finding shrew-like animals, squirrel-like animals, platypus-like mammals, and other mammals in the dinosaur rock layers. Now, I did not find any of the larger mammals in the dinosaur rock layers, but this could just as easily be explained by a misinterpretation of the geological layers. Lastly, I turned my attention to the plants, and once again, I found representatives of all of the major plant divisions living today in the dinosaur rock layers, and they looked the same. Sequoias with dinosaurs, oak trees with dinosaurs, magnolias, dogwoods, etc. It was amazing. In summary, I predicted that if evolution was not true, I would find modern appearing plants and modern appearing animals in the dinosaur rock layers. And this is in fact what I found.
What we want in science is an ability to predict. We want to have a natural law that is so obvious and clear, so well understood, that we can make predictions about what will happen. And the big thing I want from you is, can you come up with something that you can predict? Do you have a creation model that predicts something that will happen in nature?
Bill Nye is nothing but a globalist tool, a propaganda outlet. Remember, this dude is nothing but a public face posing as an extraordinary scientist in every field, used to indoctrinate kids, who even says that this was his target audience. But the fact is, his PhD is in engineering. He not only doesn't know a single current young Earth creationist prediction, but cannot name any prediction that has been made in the field. That is how biased and blind he is to the very opposition he is arguing against. And I know for a fact he doesn't, because he just asked Ken if he could even name one prediction for him.
We've already given a number of predictions, some based on flood geology and catastrophic plate tectonics. Now, we can look to numerous retrodictions, consistencies with the Bible, a literal interpretation of Genesis. The Bible tells us that it is the history book of the universe. Therefore, let's look at what it tells us and see if we can make accurate retrodictions based on that. Now, there's evidence that refutes evolution and confirms the Bible all at the same time. It's a double whammy. All human beings are profoundly similar genetically, and this points directly to Adam and Eve. Think about it. The Bible tells us that we all descend from just two people, Adam and Eve. Now, if we only started with two people, what does that do? Well, it restricts the diversity today. Now, over deep time, as the evolutionists look to, any substantially large population will undoubtedly accumulate enormous numbers of mutations. And what this results in is enormous amounts of genetic diversity. And this is a fatal problem for evolutionary theory, because it is now absolutely clear that mankind has very limited genetic variation. In a clip that has been shown, Bill Nye admits this to Ken Ham when he brings up the Human Genome Project, and that we're all incredibly similar. But while the observed low genetic diversity is a massive problem from the evolutionary perspective, this is most certainly expected and predicted from the biblical perspective, because from the biblical model, we all come from just two people. This obviously means that limited diversity is easy to explain. It's expected. The Bible predicted this. This means the death and demise of the evolutionary bottleneck theory and the evolutionary out of Africa theory. It doesn't just end there. I mean, it's now clear and evident that there exists a singular female ancestor of all human beings. She's referred to as mitochondrial Eve. Her basic DNA sequence is easily discernible and detected in humans alive today. And it's not more similar to a chimpanzee. Same thing goes for Adam. His DNA sequence is largely known as well. And contrary to what evolutionists believe, it's not at all similar to that of chimpanzees. You can look to Y chromosome Adam for this. We see three major haplogroups. We can look to Noah's flood. This story tells us that all people should be closely related. It tells us there should only be a few mitochondrial DNA lines as Shem, Ham, and Japheth's wife, and only one Y chromosome, since it's only Noah. His three sons would have inherited his Y chromosome, of course. And we should have significant evidence of rapid population growth. It turns out that this, too, is exactly what we find in modern genetics. And what's funny is this did not have to be true. The Bible tells us that it is the history book of the universe. We have evidence after evidence after evidence. Predictions are being made based on this mitochondrial DNA map of humanity. You can look to Dr. Nathaniel Jensen and his work found in replacing Darwin for this. You can look at this tree that has been, it's several 100 human individuals, and the tips on this tree, these branches, represent human individuals, and the distance of the lines, they're very long lines, would be lots of DNA differences, and the short lines would be almost none at all. If you look at the tree and what you might notice, this tree represents various people groups around the globe. Many of these lines come together as three major nodes, exactly what we'd expect and predict based on the biblical base model. This is a fact that evolutionists even acknowledge, the three major haplogroups. Now, the fact that there's three major groupings and subgroupings, we can make predictions. Now, for example, the history of humanity, it's in our genome. We can see the echo of civilization here.
Do you have a creation model that predicts something that will happen in nature?
Because that's what real science does, implying that creationism doesn't have any falsifiable predictions, thus not real science. Now, I know that a PhD is not a prerequisite to be called a scientist or to develop expertise in any subject, obviously, but Bill Nye is not an expert in climate science, yet he talks about the subject like he is and tells others that he is. And from watching him with Ken Ham, he also claims to know creation science doesn't use applicable forms of the scientific methods. Yet, he doesn't even know anything about our models, nor what type of science methods we use. He was even stumped when Ken Ham brought up the Human Genome Project that showed that all humans were 99% genetically related. The fact is, if Bill really wanted to know the truth, rather than just walk through the ark with TV cameras following him, he would have actually talked to one of the creation scientists, and not an actual preacher. Rather, he would have investigated and learned our side of the argument. The fact that he doesn't know any of this shows his absolute bias against it, but it's not a shock to me at all, really. He, like other atheists like himself, call creationists the ignorant ones. How pathetic. He is like most angry atheists today, offended by others who think differently than the way he does. He's like a lot of atheists who witch hunt today against intelligent designers or creationists, rather than actually look at the science they use and see how far superior it is to their dogmatic belief of evolutionism, built on nothing but assumption.
You and I are descendants of Martians.
Okay,
That
and
is
that's
not crazy.
And that's not crazy? You're saying we're descendants of Martians, and that's not crazy?
I say it is not crazy. It's extraordinary, but not crazy.
Okay,
and
so
we have a process
where-
by which we can prove that. That's what's so
Oh,
exciting.
prove that we're Bill, I want you to do that for all these young people. Prove that we're descendants from Martians.
I can't prove that right now.
Is it crazy that you and I are descendants of Adam and Eve?
We are descendants from a common ancestor. I don't
But
know
is
that
it
they went
crazy
by
that
those names.
is it crazy that God made the first man and woman and we're descendants of them?
For me, there's no evidence of that.
When we read the Bible, it states that God took Adam's rib to make Eve, and from them spread all humanity. Normal humans have 46 chromosomes in each cell, divided into 23 pairs, with 2 copies of chromosome 2. Since Adam's DNA was created with these 2 original chromosomes 2 in the Y chromosome, for which every normal man has, and that Y chromosome gets passed on to all future males, then it becomes easy to trace the Y chromosome back in history. The sons of these sons have the same Y chromosome as their paternal grandfather, and so on. For this reason, all male offspring from one man have the same Y chromosome. We follow that all the way back to a single point of origin, and we find our answer if creation is true or if evolution is true. The evidence tells us that a single male ancestor, Adam, was the father of all men because there was only one man alive to pass on his Y chromosome to the world population of males. If evolution were true, and there were many male ancestors to all of humanity, then there would be a huge genetic diversity and far more than a single Y chromosome parent of mankind. What does the evidence show? We do only see one Y chromosome, with 2 chromosome 2s from Adam and no other. Therefore, genetics proves creation as well, as it places a tremendous limit on the amount of genetic diversity we see in the world today. Since that is what we see, not only does it verify creation from a single male ancestor, but it validates biblical account, and there being only one paternal line going all the way back to Adam, with no other males alive, contrary to the evolutionary theory. Also, all humans came from a single female. I don't think people consider this fact very much. Let's just take a look at that last comment that I made about all humans being from a single female. What are the odds of this? If a secular evolutionist even considered this for just a moment, rather than shrugging it off with excuses like there must have been a bottleneck, or there were probably many other women alive and those women didn't have kids, or maybe all of them just had boys, completely non-logical, especially when I describe the scenario for you in a minute. Besides, even according to their own theory, they have no proof of any bottleneck occurring, not in paleontology, the fossil record, or geology, in the geological column. So, what evidence do we have for this belief of a bottleneck? They don't have anything for it. That's your answer. A failed hypothesis is all that they have. You see, this is the real problem. According to the evolution theory, about 100,000 to 200,000 years ago, there were about 10,000 to 30,000 individuals. That's an estimate. Now let's just say half were women. That leaves us with 5,000 or 15,000, whatever you want to go with. Let's just say that the average is 10,000 for this debate. So now we have 10,000 different lines of possible mitochondrial DNA to be passed down. Yet we only have one today. What are the odds of this? That's highly improbable. But if you start with the biblical account, this lines up perfectly as to what we would expect and what we do see. There should be just one line, and there is just one line, exactly what the empirical evidence shows. Vast correlations line up directly with what the Bible says, and this is undeniable evidence.
So what's the difference between science and observational science?
Stabbed yourself in the foot on this one, buddy, because creation science uses observational rates down the line. No assumption required. We have been genetically deteriorating since the fall of Adam, because sin brought death into the world, and rapid disease increase is evident, just like the Bible describes. Genomic decay is evident. We can see it not only in man, but even of the beast of the world. And we can show with the empirical evidence that there is a fast-ticking mitochondrial clock in not just man, but all life on Earth. As where evolution only uses bias assumption based on their own molecular clock invention, which has been calibrated by only using their fossil record inference, not observable, testable, falsifiable predictions. As you can see, when someone says creationism isn't real science, they have no idea what they're talking about. It's far superior science than the biased assumption-based filled evolutionary science taught today. Take, for example, the best way of measuring mutations is using observable, testable, repeatable evidence to calculate, wouldn't you agree? Well, we creationists take a family tree and say it's been this many generations since the Y chromosome has been separated from its parent common ancestor. We then count up the mutations between them and divide them by the number of generations. Easy. When you do this, you get a very high mutation rate, just like the empirical evidence shows. Most mutations rate calculate anywhere between 64 and 200 new mutations every generation. So you have more mutations than your parents, and they have more mutations than their parents, and so on. This is where the difference comes from. You see, as creationists, we use the observable rates, used in the genealogical method, as where evolutionists use their phylogenetic method based off nothing but pure assumption. First, they assume common ancestry to be true, so they immediately add on an imagined, unknown, unfound chimp ancestor. Then they will take these two genes that are shared between the human and chimps, and they'll count out the number of differences and divide them by 6.5 million years. Another assumption. The number of years that they assume the human split between the missing chimp ancestor. And that number gives you a very small mutation rate number. So they assume long-scale evolution already to be true, then they assume a missing link common ancestor, then they assume a split occurred between us and them. All storytelling bias assumptions involved. The observable evidence lines up with creation, not evolution, and not even close. And this is what you will see down the line. They do the same thing to mitochondrial clocks, which I showed you before this, tossing out the actual observable rates tested, seen in the lab. Totally biased and unscientific.
You know what's interesting? When the Human Genome Project mapped the human genome, they said there's only one race of people. You know what that confirms? The Bible. Because we all go back to Adam and Eve, we're all one race.
So I don't think it confirms the Bible. It just makes the Bible consistent with nature on this one point. My scientific colleagues go to places like Greenland, the Arctic, they go to Antarctica, and they drill into the ice with hollow drill bits. And we pull out long cylinders of ice, long ice rods. And these are made of snow. And by long tradition, it's called snow ice. And snow ice forms over the winter as snowflakes fall and are crushed down by subsequent layers. They're crushed together and trapping the little bubbles. And we find certain of these cylinders to have 680,000 layers. 680,000 snow, winter, summer cycles. How could it be that just 4,000 years ago, all of this ice formed?
When it comes to the ice core layers, we actually found what's called the Lost Squadron. And the Lost Squadron were a plane that were lost during World War II. And when a very rich man wanted to come along and he wanted to buy those planes and he put them on his property or start a museum, not really sure which one he wanted to do. He wanted to go find these planes. So he spent a lot of money and he went out there and he assumed that, he would just see the planes, but he couldn't. And they were actually so far down that when they actually dug down, they found them, which would have been an equivalent of 135,000 years, because the layers weren't laid down every year. They were laid down by cold, hot, cold, hot, cold, hot. So the prediction of ice core layers, when they see those strata, which look like they're annual, are actually just dependent on the day or the season, and they can fluctuate and change.
Top 5 reasons as to why creationism is an assault on science. Well, you deny your critical thinking skills. It's completely unreasonable. They're pyramids 5,000 years old, for crying out loud.
First of all, radio halo dating in coal is closest to the conventional dating method. Way back in the 70s, Dr. Robert Gentry pointed to radio halos in coal from the Triassic, Jurassic, and Eocene rock layers. In evolutionary years, those layers are alleged to be 37 to 245 million years old. Wood was laid down and infiltrated with uranium. The uranium, as it broke down radioactively, left behind a sphere of radiation damage called a radiohalo around the lump of uranium. The wood was then compressed by tectonic upheaval into coal, and the spheres of radiation damage were compressed as well into flattened spheres. The uranium kept decaying and made a new sphere of radiation damage. Each alpha particle emitted from the uranium travels through the coal, damaging the coal. They radiate out in all directions, but they all end at the same distance because of the level of energy emission. So eventually enough particles are emitted to form these spheres of damage around the lump of uranium. The problem was that the amount of particles emitted since the compression event was only a few thousand years worth of radioactivity. And all of the coal samples had these flattened radiohalos within the same time frame. So what does that mean? It means that the 37 million evolutionary years to 245 million evolutionary years were all compressed into one event and one time frame only several thousand years ago. That's right, not even 10,000 years ago. But let us not forget the rate team's helium diffusion dating method. Uranium and zircon crystals embedded in granite basement rocks, dated over 2 billion evolutionary years old, gives off helium as it decays. The helium, being such a small gas molecule, leaks out of the crystal very fast, while the uranium that's producing it is a very slow rate. The rate team then made 2 predictions for the leakage rate. One based on the evolutionary age of the rock, and one based on the rock actually being 6,000 years old. When the actual lab work was performed, it wound up squarely on the 6,000 year age. This was basement rock, the foundational rock of the continents, now dated to 6,000 years old. Now, there's more ways we can deduce a young age of the Earth, but that's just 2 examples, and I'll have to do because we're out of time.
Now, most people just take for granted that the Earth is millions and billions of years old, but the evidence points in an entirely different direction. Here's just one example. Many of the elements found in rocks are radioactive and they decay over time. Now, 2 of those elements are uranium and thorium. When they decay, they produce lots of helium as a byproduct. Now, helium is a very slippery gas and it doesn't bond with any other element, so it diffuses into the atmosphere quite quickly. Now, scientists in New Mexico were drilling into pre-Cambrian rocks. These are the basement rocks of Earth and are thought by many to be 1.5 billion years old, a thought supposedly confirmed by radiometric dating. But much to the surprise of these researchers, these supposedly old rocks contained large amounts of helium. Over 50% of the helium that was produced was still there. Now, these rocks are deep in the Earth, and therefore they're hotter than other rocks. The hotter the rock, the faster the helium escapes. So why are these rocks filled with helium? Some atheistic and evolutionary researchers have tried to discredit the finding or explain it away, but every attempt has fallen short. The evidence that these rocks can't be over 1 billion years old just won't go away. You know, a maximum age based on helium dating is a mere 100,000 years. Now, that's just a blink in an evolutionary scale, and yet these rocks are supposedly some of Earth's oldest. Interestingly, based on current helium diffusion rates, the average age of these rocks is a mere 6,000 years old. Does that number sound familiar? Well, that's the age of the Earth that we get when we start with God's Word. These Precambrian rocks are pre-flood rocks from the time of creation. So, according to the Bible, they're roughly 6,000 years old. And this is exactly what the observational evidence suggests. Just one more scientific reason that you shouldn't believe in geologic evolution. It takes a lot of faith.
Bill Nye and other evolutionists like to make this claim that there's never been a fossil found outside of the predicted layer of the geologic column. Well, this simply isn't true, and they also make the claim that coal was formed 250 million years ago. Well, we can debunk both of these ideas just by looking at a couple of discoveries that we've made. For instance, we found an iron hammer that was surrounded by seashells inside of its layer. They took those seashells and they dated them according to their radiometric dating, and they dated at 400 million years old. How's that possible if we found a man-made hammer inside of them? It's also interesting to note that part of the handle of that hammer turned to coal. Newton Anderson found a bell inside of a lump of coal in 1994. We found a man-made gold chain inside of a lump of coal. We found a cast iron pot inside of a lump of coal. If coal was formed 250 million years ago, then how are we finding all these man-made tools inside of them? We found some sort of vessel that was made of silver and zinc that was in a rock that was supposedly 600 million years old. That was in Massachusetts in 1851. We found a clay doll inside of a rock layer that was supposedly 12 million years old. That was discovered by a well driller. I mean, the list goes on and on. There are also a large number of failed evolutionary predictions. For instance, vestigial structures. They used to think that there were all these parts of the human body that didn't serve any sort of function, and they called them vestigial structures, and they used to claim that there were hundreds of these throughout the human body. But the more we learned about the human body, the more we realized that there are no parts of it that don't serve a function. In fact, the only possible vestigial structure left would be the male nipple, and that might serve a purpose that we just aren't aware of. So the reality of the situation is, if you're making all these, thousands of predictions, you're liable to get a couple of them right.
Evolution is the fundamental idea in biology. So you're not going to have a next generation of physicians or people to research vaccines without an understanding of evolution.
He brings up evolution theory when he meant to bring up cell theory. He doesn't even know the difference. Do you want to know what evolution theory has actually brought to medicine? The removal of the gallbladder, thinking that it was worthless and harmful to have. The removal of these vital organs that actually serve a purpose, and they're not vestigial remnants left over. So, let me be clear. Evolutionary theory has caused the death and suffering of an innumerable amount of people. When evolution-indoctrinated scientists failed to discover the purpose for which the appendix was created, for example, their indoctrination led them to illogically conclude that it had little to no physiological function, that it was just an evolutionary leftover, a vestigial organ. Thus began the unnecessary removal of hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of people's appendixes, as they spread this evolutionary concept to doctors. Now we've learned the valuable immunological role of the appendix. Little did they know back then that it was a backup immune system which produces killer B cells, like the thyroid produces killer T cells. It also plays a replenishing healthy gut bacteria role after sickness, especially after diarrhea. But how many people suffered infections, chronic health problems, and death from compromised immune systems due to this loss of bacteria, vital to our body's defense system, all because of evolutionary dogma? We will never truly know the negative impact, but the numbers are off the charts. Evolution causes far more harm than good. So, Bill Nye, the science guy, you're obviously not the science guy you claim to be, because you don't even have the basic understanding of the difference of theories. First of all, no, it's cell theory. That is the bedrock of biology. Emergence is the universal theme of biology. Evolution is just an extension of that. Just like how any field would branch out, some become dilapidated, useless twigs whose development doesn't benefit anyone. The bedrock of medicine is the germ theory of disease, which is an extension of cell theory, not evolution theory. It is an understanding of the methods of treatment of disease, with a fluid understanding of pathophysiology, anatomy, and internal medicine. This is my specialty, and I write books on it. You have either such a lack of understanding in this area, or you're completely lying about it. You will never see a patient get cured by understanding that they're an ape, or related to a chimpanzee, or whatever you want to scrounge up in the fossil record and say we're related to. That nonsense doesn't belong in biology, where actual observable, testable evidence matters. Just like how it's a doctor's job to treat a patient, it's a biologist's job to use his understanding of cellular life to somehow benefit humanity. What does evolutionary theory have to do with this? Nothing. What does a fossil benefit? How does a society further improve by continuously digging up useless fossils and putting them in museums? When a patient is dying, what are you going to do? Shovel interpretational evidence down their throat? Understanding evolution is only relevant in a few niche fields, and it really just boils down to an understanding of the applicable mechanisms of Mendelian genetics, which was discovered before evolution ever became popularized. Antibiotic resistance takes a paragraph for me to explain, and doesn't require a course in phylogenetics. Are these objectable true facts? Yes, but you don't seem to care. You just care that evolution is true, because you need it to be true. Your job and income rely on it. The concept of evolutionary theory in the minds of children is destructive. It causes more kids to become atheists than any other theory on Earth. And atheists lead the world in depression, medication intake, suicide, and school shootings. Good job, Bill Nye.
Can you repeat it? I'm sorry.
They said if Darwin's title of The Origin of Species is it racist?
Yeah, of course it's racist.
Gotcha.
Well, how about rubidium and strontium? You want to start there? What we have found through chemistry is that certain radioactive elements will substitute in certain non-radioactive elements in certain rock crystals. So when they do that, you can measure how many of these radioactive atoms got inserted in the crystal, and so you can determine the age of the rocks. And it's not 6,000 years, it's 4.5 billion.
Nearly every textbook in science magazine teaches that the Earth is billions of years old, and the primary dating method used for determining this is what is called radioisotope dating, or radiometric dating. Now, this is a reliable method for measuring absolute ages of rocks and the age of the Earth, right? First off, many scientists now regard the age of the Earth to be between 4.55 and 4.6 billion years old. Okay, so if this method is reliable and accurate, why the 50 million year discrepancy? That seems like a lot. But let's get into some details here and see what's going on. Keep in mind that there's all kinds of scientific jargon on this topic, and so we'll just present a very straightforward, simplified version of the process. Radiometric dating is the process of estimating the ages of rocks based on the decay of radioactive elements in them. Basically, there are certain kinds of atoms in nature that are unstable and spontaneously decay into other kinds of atoms. For instance, uranium will radioactively decay through a series of steps until it becomes the stable element called lead. The original element is called the parent element, and the end result is called the daughter element. Radioisotope dating is commonly used to date igneous rocks, rocks which formed when hot molten material cooled and solidified. The dating clock started when the rock cooled. During the molten state, it is assumed that the intense heat forced any gaseous daughter elements to escape. It is assumed that once the rock cooled, no more atoms escaped, and any daughter element now found in the rock is a result of radioactive decay since that rock formed. The decay rate is measured in terms of half-life, that is, the length of time it takes half of the remaining atoms of a radioactive parent element to decay. Now, of course, that can be measured in a laboratory, and it is assumed that since we know the decay rate, we can calculate backwards and come up with the age of the rock. But is that all there is to it? Here's where it gets tricky. It's true we can measure a decay rate using observational science, but there's another kind of science that is required to accurately calculate dates for rocks, and that is what we call historical science. Historical science deals with the things in the past, and therefore it cannot be repeated and tested. Dating methods require both types of science, because in order to get accurate rock dates, one would have to accurately know both the decay rate and the initial conditions of the rock sample, right? Since radioisotope dating uses both types of science, we can't directly measure the ages of rocks. There are assumptions involved. For instance, how do we know what the initial conditions were in the rock sample? How do we know the amounts of parent or daughter elements now in that sample haven't been altered by other processes in the past? How does someone know the decay rate has remained constant since the rock formed? The answer is they don't. Let's simplify here and talk about a typical hourglass. Let's say you walk into a room and you see an hourglass with sand at the top and sand at the bottom, and some sand sprinkling from the top chamber to the bottom. Well, observational science would allow us to see and measure the sand, and then calculate how long the hourglass has been running, right? We could make our sand measurements and then calculate when the hourglass was turned over, right? Well, those calculations could be wrong, because we may have failed to consider some major assumptions, like, was there any sand at the bottom when the hourglass was turned over? Has any sand been added or taken out of the hourglass? Has the sand always been falling at a constant rate? Since we did not observe the initial conditions when the hourglass started, and we haven't been watching the sand all the time since then, we must make assumptions. All three of those assumptions can affect our time calculations. Now, of course, there's more to understanding all of this, but enough said.
Scientific value being stronger evidence than everything you can observe around you in nature is really an extraordinary claim.
There is one thing that is not shared among people: deletions. You see, God made us a great design, a backup of our genome. If one of ours, say from our father's side, breaks, our mother's side will keep us alive. One of you listening to me right now is missing over 1 million base pairs of DNA from your genome in different pieces that have been deleted throughout time. Interestingly though, these deletions are not shared among populations because they break or decay at random. Most of the diversity is shared among populations, but diversity of the deletions are not, meaning 1, there are new errors, 2, they are post-Babel, and 3, meaning the human genome is falling apart. Genetic entropy is an observable fact. Here's a study that analyzed 20 human genomes. They concluded, we summarized different categories of variation in each genome. in a total across all 20 of the genomes, finding a surprising number of variant predictions to reduce or remove the proteins encoded by different genes. So, we even have more evidence that people today are missing genes. In fact, surprising for evolutionary believing scientists, you're not supposed to delete information over time. You're supposed to evolve new information over time and preserve it. But what we see is different things falling out of the genome and rapidly. Dr. John Sanford predicted the extinction of the human race after 350 generations. Right now, we are at 300 since the time of Adam. He predicted this over a decade ago. And with more new studies recently being done using trio methods, the prediction that he had made is more clear than ever. There is a continuous buildup of mutations that are constantly adding up in the genome and decaying it. This proves a few things. One, if mutations and selection cannot preserve the information already within the genome, then how could it have already created the information in the first place? 2. The constant buildup of near-neutral mutations are constant. Now that this is proven, it is easy to trace this back in time using the observable rate, where we end up with a time of 0 mutations, which would have been Adam, and it happens to land exactly as predicted by young Earth creationism at almost 6,000 years ago. 3. Even modern-day secular scientists agree with this, and they see the problem. A rise in disease attributed to what they thought and believed were neutral mutations. So, besides the observable mutation rate to use as a clock, we also have a fast-ticking mitochondrial clocks, which also prove young Earth creationism. Dr. Jensen has used this fast-ticking mitochondrial region in his prediction called the transatlantic slave trade mutation rate of the Khoisan people. The results of this come out soon. However, using these rates already, which have been validated, this again proves young Earth creationism by showing that just 6,000 years ago, the clock started. Even studying human genetic diversity, the numbers land exactly with what young Earth creationism would predict, and not even close to evolutionary predictions. Multiple secular studies have validated a fast-ticking mitochondrial clock. Even tracing the Y chromosome back in time proves again young Earth creationism. Time and time again, the observable rates prove young Earth creationism and invalidate evolution. The only way evolution passes as real science today is by using mathematical assumptions into the equation. If it is removed, evolution truly has nothing. The observable rates prove the truth. The lies of evolution will not go unnoticed on our channel. Evolution has lied long enough to the public, and it's time for it to be exposed for the fraud that it truly is.
Oh, by the way, you wouldn't have televisions without science.
So then you're saying
there
that
are things that I accept as true that are not.
That are not true.
Let me ask you a question. Does the fact that fewer people are believing in evolution suggest that maybe we aren't evolving?
Oh.
See, that's why Sam's
I think the pendulum will swing.
Bill Nye the Science Guy. Bill Nye the Science Guy.
Are we different to the animals?
Yes, you can run this test too.
Yeah, so we're different.
Yeah.
So,
well, no. We're exactly the same in every possible way.
are we different to the animals?
Yes.
No. We're exactly the same in every possible way.